Hello, I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics in literature and cultural studies. This particular video is on William Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. I want to begin by giving you some critical background for thinking about comedic drama. One tradition of criticism and scholarship is called archetypal. Archetypes are recurring patterns that are common to human experience across different times of history, different places, different cultures, and in some deep way, so the argument goes, they have an effect on human consciousness and experience and behavior. For example, the pattern of birth, growth, maturation to death that's experienced by all humans, animals, and plants would be an archetypal pattern. One way of thinking about comedy is to say that comedy often invokes a spirit of disruption, of rebellion, of irreverence, of liberation. Laughter in general and comedy in particular is a way for those who don't have as much power in a society to equalize the balance somewhat against those who do have power, or simply to express dissatisfaction with social constraints or simply the way things are, just by busting loose and having a good time. The disruptive tendency in comedy might be associated with satire, the comic impulse to ridicule someone who is taking himself or herself too seriously, or satire that is used to criticize, obliquely or indirectly maybe, leadership with which one disagrees. Opposed to that disruptive archetypal pattern might be the restorative comedy. The restorative comedy seeks to bring the community together, seeks to bind all the individuals in a community together into a common bond of fellowship. A typical pattern of this comedy might begin with someone who is on the margins of the community, a misfit, the ugly duckling, Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer, and the list could go on. And during the course of the drama, during the course of the story, someone who began as a misfit is discovered to have value, to be important, worthy of love and admiration. And by the end of the story, the outsider is brought into the center, and the community is made whole. The potential disruption posed to the community by the presence of an outsider is diffused, and the community is safe. Shakespeare uses both of these archetypal patterns of comedy in his plays. Another critical framework for thinking about comedy in large terms would be to look at the historical evolution of comedy in the European tradition. The starting point here would be a Greek playwright called Aristophanes, who lived in the 5th century before the Common Era. Aristophanes wrote disruptive comedies. He wrote satires, often with animals like frogs or birds as characters standing in for public figures whom he wished to criticize. He also wrote one play, still performed fairly often, called Lysistrata, in which the women of the community all go on a sex strike. They refuse to have sex until the men agree to stop fighting. Critics and scholars now call the comedy of Aristophanes, and those who wrote at the same time, the old comedy. And in the next century, in the 4th century, before the Common Era, a playwright called Menander developed a new form of comedy, which tended more in the direction of the restorative pattern, the restorative archetype that I mentioned before. Menander's restorative comedy is now called by critics and scholars the new comedy of ancient Greece, to distinguish it from the old comedy, the satiric, disruptive comedy of Aristophanes. A few hundred years later, a couple of poets in ancient Rome picked up and elaborated Menander's new comedy. In the comedies of Plautus and Terence, there's a typical pattern. A young boy and a young girl fall in love at the beginning of the play. But there's an obstacle. Her parents disapprove of the young man. Maybe he doesn't have enough money, maybe they don't like his family. So the course of the action involves how the young couple will circumvent the disapproval of her parents and find a way to get together and to convince the parents to accept the outcome at the end of the play. Oftentimes, there's a sympathetic servant or some sympathetic uncle, some member of the older generation who sympathizes with the young people and will help them get around the block presented by the parents. Maybe the young couple elope, maybe the sympathetic servant helps them break the news to the parents and resolves all the tensions. So at the end, everyone is happy. And the society can continue in the transition from one generation to the next without falling apart. So that's the Roman New Comedy. And Shakespeare uses this pattern, this plot structure, again and again in his comedies. And sometimes he even gives it a twist and brings it into his tragedies. For example, if you know Romeo and Juliet, it begins really as one of these restorative romantic comedies, but in the third act, things go terribly wrong, and the happy comedy winds down into a very moving tragedy. In Midsummer Night's Dream, there's not one couple about to get married, but three couples, two young couples, a middle-aged to older couple, and the king and the queen of the fairies, whose marriage seems to be possibly on the rocks. Add to that a play within the play of Pyramus and Thisbe, performed by a group of amateur actors at the end of the play. The confusions and misadventures of these lovers multiply hilariously. With that, I'll conclude this message, but I'll have more to say about A Midsummer Night's Dream in subsequent webcasts. If you have questions or comments, send me an email.